Several big games in college football this weekend, and one of those is certainly an SEC East matchup as you have Tennessee traveling down between the hedges to take on number 3 Georgia. And right now to discuss that one, very excited to welcome in for the first time from Dogs 24/7, Palmer Thombs. Palmer, we appreciate you joining the program.
Yeah, Bubba, thanks for having me on. Really excited about this game that's taking place between the hedges on Saturday, and really excited to break it down with you all tonight.
You know, in game one, you guys traveled out to Fayetteville to take on the Razorbacks, trailed in the middle of the third quarter in that one, but figured it out in the second half. And then in the second game against Auburn, the Dogs were just lights out early on and cruised to an easy victory over the Tigers. So just tell us your take on UGA thus far.
Yeah, I think there were certainly some first game jitters, especially with the new offense that Georgia's having this season under new offensive coordinator Todd Monken. There's a lot of change there. Obviously, at the quarterback position, Jake Fromm is now gone after 3 years as the starter. And so breaking in a new quarterback at the position is certainly a challenge, and especially with all the extra precautions and challenges that COVID-19 has presented to the world of college football as a whole. Implementing a new offense is very, very difficult this year. You look at Georgia and that quarterback room, everyone expected it to be Jamie Newman, Wake Forest grad transfer that arrived in Athens in January. He was going to go through spring practice, was going to work out with the team this summer, and was expected to be the starter once the season rolled around in August. Obviously, there was no spring practice. COVID-19 changes everything, and he decides to opt out. Then Georgia brings in USC transfer JT Daniels, former 5-star quarterback. In the 2018 class, he was behind only Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields, and we've seen how well those two guys have done. So I think there was a lot of excitement to see what Daniels could do. It took him some time to get medically cleared, but he was granted immediate eligibility by the NCAA and the SEC. So there's still some excitement there, but it wasn't him who tried it out the first game. It was Dwan Mathis, who he's got an incredible story. Came to Georgia. Had a cyst removed from his brain, so he had to sit out all of his freshman year, and wasn't able to get full reps in practice. Helped run the scout team, but obviously zero contact there as they were being extra precautionary. Not just with a quarterback, but with someone who's got that kind of medical condition, and so there was a lot of excitement to see him trot out there. He didn't have the greatest of first halves, and in comes Stetson Bennett, who was 4th or 5th on the depth chart during spring practice. And, another kid who's got a great story came to Georgia in 2017 as a walk-on. He ran the scout team offense. You talk to players from that team, and he's got, a ton of accolades from those guys, a ton of credit from those guys. Ran the Baker Mayfield-led Oklahoma offense before the Rose Bowl that Georgia ended up winning. And you really helped that team put up some great performances in practice that those guys still talk about to this day. He ends up leaving Georgia in 2018, heads to Mississippi Community College for a year, plays JUCO ball there, comes back to Athens, and sits under Jake Fromm as the backup for a year. Like I said, he was the 4th or 5th stringer in preseason camp, and he's now the guy. Comes in at halftime or second quarter of the Arkansas game, saves the day for the Dogs there, and had a great performance past Saturday against Auburn. And so there's a lot of excitement, a lot of change, and I think the offense and the quarterback position specifically is the biggest storyline through 2 games.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I was able to watch the Auburn game or much of it, like I mentioned before we started recording, and I had not seen any of the Arkansas game, but I was very impressed with Stetson Bennett and what he brought to the table. And then hearing his story as a former walk-on certainly makes you excited for the young man, and just living out his dream, doing what he loves for the number 3 program in the country, and with everything that he brought to the table, that connection between him and Jackson, 9 receptions for nearly 150 yards, and that's one that the country may learn more and more about. We'll keep an eye on that here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think Curious Jackson is a guy who really has broken out in these first two games. You mentioned the connection between him and Stetson Bennett. He's not even Georgia's number one receiver. That title would clearly go to George Pickens, who's, drawing all these preseason accolades, a lot of attention. And I think because of Pickens, Jackson is benefiting, from Pickens drawing double coverage, slot guy being open. But it's certainly exciting to see what Kyrus Jackson has done in these first two games. And I would certainly look to him as a breakout player and key to this game.
Palmer, back to the quarterbacks, just a question on where they were stacking up and what it's going to look like moving forward. I assume Jamie Newman was a clear-cut starter going into the season. I guess first question, was that the case, or was he getting pushed hard for that spot? And then everybody assumed JT Daniels was just going to come in, win healthy and play and start. What's his status going to be like moving forward?
Yeah, I think he was being pushed. I think Jamie Newman was being pushed for that spot. But Kirby Smart said after the game on Saturday that he'd be lying to us if he didn't say that he didn't think that Jamie Newman would be the starter. So I think it was, to answer your first question, I think there was a clear expectation that Jamie Newman would be the guy for this offense, and that he would be a leader in this transition to a new age of Georgia offense under Todd Monken. I think there was a lot of excitement about, opening up the offense a little more, opening up the passing game. Monken, with some history at Oklahoma State and in the NFL as well, was a head coach at Southern Miss where he put up some good numbers offensively, had, 1,000-yard receivers in the same season that he had 1,000-yard running backs. And so I think with the talent that Georgia had, there was a lot of excitement about that and Jamie Newman being the guy to lead that offense. To answer your second question about JT Daniels, I think who knows when we'll see JT. He's been medically cleared, was not medically cleared for the Arkansas game. He did travel with the team, which I thought was an interesting move by Kirby Smart to use one of those precious 70 spots on a SEC road game travel roster, in hopes that JT would be cleared before that game. I think there was a huge competition between him and Dwan Mathis for that starting spot, but it all kind of depended on him being cleared. And so he wasn't cleared. Mathis ends up starting. And then, like I said, Mathis didn't have the best of days. And with Daniels not being cleared, they had to turn to Stetson Bennett. So I think it'll be interesting because of the way that Stetson Bennett has played. I think it's hard to turn away from him. I think he's built up so much confidence and so much momentum with this offense in, 6 quarters of play in the second half of the Arkansas game and 4 quarters against Auburn on Saturday. I think it's hard to turn away from him. But, at the same time, you've got to wonder, there's got to be a reason that Stetson Bennett was 4th on the depth chart. There's got to be a reason why JT Daniels was a starter his freshman year at USC. And so I think that from a talent perspective, JT Daniels is certainly up there with the best of them in terms of just raw talent. But I think the way that Stetson Bennett has gotten this team to buy into him as the quarterback and him as their leader, I think it's tough to turn away from him. And so I think it'll kind of depend on the way that Bennett continues to play. If he continues to put up the big numbers that he has in these last 2 games, I have a hard time seeing Kirby Smart turn away from that kind of production.
Palmer, off the air, we were talking about the tremendous job that Jeremy Pruitt's done in Knoxville. The Volunteers have won 8 consecutive ball games. They're off to that 2-0 start, having won at South Carolina, and then last week a comfortable win at home over Eli Drinkwitz in Missouri. But taking a look at this matchup, just everything the Vols bring to the table, we're talking about the UGA offense, and how do you see that matchup playing out between Stetson Bennett and the UGA offense and Tennessee's defense that's given up about 360 yards a game, I think, thus far through 2 ball games?
Yeah, you mentioned the way that Jeremy Pruitt has kind of turned this program around at Tennessee. I grew up in the Volunteer State, so grew up watching Tennessee football and very familiar with what Butch Jones was doing at Tennessee before Pruitt came to town. And he definitely has turned it around. And I think the biggest turnaround has been in terms of recruiting. Obviously X's and O's is big in the SEC, but Jimmy's and Joe's is just as big too. So, the way that Jeremy Pruitt has turned around this program has been up front. I think the biggest transition has been on the offensive line, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But defensively, they've got some talent there too. I think, like most games in the SEC, this one's going to be decided in the trenches. I think the way that Tennessee matches up in the secondary, they've got a couple of guys back there that could give Stetson Bennett some trouble. Bryce Thompson, Alontae Taylor, and Sean Schamberger, to name a couple. They can match up well with Georgia's receivers. And I think Jeremy Pruitt knows how to match up against Georgia's receivers, having coached against them, in his time at Alabama as the defensive coordinator there and as Tennessee's head coach these past 2 seasons. So I think Georgia's going to have to show that they can run the ball. They showed it against Auburn, ran for over 200 yards against the Tigers. And I think this game is going to be one up front in the trenches for Georgia once again. Henry To'oto as a linebacker, he's an elite run stopper. He's the best player, could be the best inside linebacker on the field Saturday for either team. But I don't know that Tennessee has the guys around him in the front seven to stop the Georgia running game. And I think Zamir White, James Cook, if he's healthy, he got banged up against Auburn and he's a game time decision. But, also the guys behind him and Kenny McIntosh, Kendall Milton, and Dejon Edwards. I think Georgia's offensive line is coming into this game with a chip on their shoulder. They've heard all the talk about the Tennessee offensive line, and they want to prove that that they're worthy of hype around them too. And I think those Georgia running backs, after all this is known as RBU, I think, they're going to have a chip on their shoulder and they're going to want to win this game in the trenches.
And Palmer, you look at this season, and on the outside, I look at it, and obviously it's going to be extremely tough with just the straight SEC schedule. Then they go ahead and beat Auburn last weekend. An emotional game, even though Georgia dominated. That's still a rivalry game. Then they move over to Tennessee now this weekend. It's another huge, important game, but Tennessee, they haven't been what they were back in the late 90s for a while. They've been having issues, but it seems like they're much better, at least kind of on the right track. What's the mindset been for Georgia, and how important this game really is, to get to their goals?
Yeah, I think Tennessee is being considered one of those teams in the SEC East that can contend with, or is a potential contender with Georgia and Florida for the championship spot in the SEC championship game. So for that SEC East title, I think Georgia knows that they've got to handle their business in the East, and taking care of Tennessee this Saturday is going to be big for that. And then you mentioned the way that this season is set up and it being all SEC with Auburn early in the season, a top 10 matchup there as the Tigers came in at number 7. Tennessee's coming in at number 12 this week. And then you look ahead on Georgia's schedule, they've got Alabama next week, who's probably going to be number 2, assuming that Clemson takes down Miami in that showcase Saturday night. But, this opening stretch is really defining for Georgia because I think a lot of people looked at it and understood the offense could have their struggles, with all the changes at quarterback, coordinator, everything else that's involved there. Offensive line as well, losing 3 starters to the NFL and Cade Mays to Tennessee. I think that there was an understanding that this offense could struggle. They haven't struggled as much as people might have expected, which I think that's a credit to Stetson Bennett and a credit to Todd Monken as an offensive coordinator. But even with those struggles, Georgia's defense has been incredible, allowing 10 points to Arkansas and just 6 to Auburn. Haven't allowed a rushing touchdown this season. That'll be tested on Saturday against the Vols. But I think, just coming out of the gate strong, especially with how front-loaded Georgia's schedule is, with those 3 games that I mentioned, Auburn, Tennessee, and Alabama back-to-back-to-back. I think setting the tone in the SEC East and kind of getting that win over Tennessee and moving on to Florida as the biggest contender in the East is certainly big for Georgia.
Palmer, we've talked about the matchup between the UGA offense and then the Tennessee defense. A moment ago, you referenced the Tennessee offense and their rushing attack led by Georgia transfer Cade Mays. You read my mind. And that was going to be my next point, just talking about how the Vols ran for over 230 yards on a little over 50 carries against Missouri. And I know I was reading that up front, I think 4 out of their 5 linemen were very highly regarded recruits. So just talk about how you see that matchup, Tennessee's offense against the UGA defense, when you were just talking about how stout the Bulldogs are and how stout they've been under Kirby Smart.
Yeah, Tennessee offensive coordinator Jim Chaney spent some time at Georgia with Kirby Smart. He was his first offensive coordinator when he came to Athens. And so Chaney knows how to attack this Georgia defense. Obviously, there's been some personnel change, but schematically, it's the same as it has been, and same that it was when Chaney was in town. And Jim Chaney did it at Georgia. He's done it everywhere he's gone, and he's doing it at Tennessee. He wants to run the ball. And when you've got two running backs like Ty Chandler and Eric Gray, 2 dynamic backs, Kirby Smart said, that those 2 remind him of Georgia's running backs, which is, high praise from a head coach who emphasizes running the ball and stopping the run so much. When you've got those 2 type of running backs in Chandler and Gray, and then an offensive line that returns 5 starters from last year and adds Cade Mays to the mix, the game is that. I mean, that is the recipe for a Tennessee upset. Is if they can run the ball, that's going to be the deciding factor. If you look at the Tennessee-Georgia rivalry, 9 of the last 10 games have been won by the team that runs the ball better in that matchup. And so I think once again that's going to decide it here. I mentioned it with Georgia; they've got a big emphasis on running the ball, and you look at Tennessee; they lose their 2 top receivers from the last couple of seasons, Juwan Jennings and Marquez Callaway. Quarterback Jarrett Garantano is he's had an up and down career at Tennessee. He's been there for quite some time, and this is his first time with the same offensive coordinator from the previous season. But I think, there's obviously a question around him and his ability to lead a team, and his ability to, not turn the ball over, make the right decisions. And so with that, with the questions at wide receiver, with the questions at quarterback, and with what you've got in the running game, Tennessee's going to want to run the ball. And for Georgia to stop that ultimately means big Jordan Davis in the middle, number 99, playing nose tackle for Georgia, coming in at he is huge. He takes up 2 guys, typically is a double team kind of guy, comes in at 6'6", 330. That's going to require some attention from the Tennessee offensive line, which, when as the Georgia defenders have said, 2 on me means someone's free. That means those linebackers are going to be able to run free and stop the Tennessee running game. So I think, like I said, with Georgia, it starts in the trenches. It starts in the trenches here when Tennessee's got the ball too. They're going to want to run the ball, and Georgia's going to want to stop the run. And I certainly think that the Bulldogs are up for the challenge.
I'm going to throw you a curveball, Palmer, to ask you a special teams question. How does Georgia feel with their kicking situation with, Rodrigo Blankenship been an awesome kicker there for so long. How do they feel with their special teams?
Yeah, I have been really impressed with Georgia's special teams so far. They bring in new special teams coordinator, Scott Cochran, who was the former strength and conditioning coach at Alabama. To bring him in as former special teams coordinator, Scott Fountain heads to Arkansas with former Georgia offensive line coach, Sam Pittman, who's now the head coach there. So they bring in Cochran, and that was a big offseason hire, to take someone away from Nick Saban and kind of, chink away at that armor. I think that's been big, and it has proved big so far. Georgia's had some really dynamic special teams early on. You've seen it in the return game. We mentioned Kyrus Jackson and his performance in the passing game, he's been great as a punt returner. Averaged, I think it was 17 yards per return against Arkansas in the opener. Kenny McIntosh has taken several out to the 40 and beyond as a kick returner. And so the special teams is something that Georgia's confident in, and certainly the kicking game as well. Jake Camarda as a punter, he's in his third season as Georgia's starting punter, earned SEC Special Teams Player of the Week honors against Arkansas with booming kicks inside of the 20. He's looked great. And then in terms of the place kicking, Jack Podlesny, who won the starting job this fall, he's been great. Missed on a field goal last week, but he made all of his kicks against Arkansas. I think he's 3 of 4 on the year and has made some longer kicks. Doesn't appear to have quite the leg that Rodrigo Blankenship had, where he was making it from 50 and plus with ease. But I think there's certainly a ton of confidence in Podlesny.
Palmer, shifting gears a bit, during our pre-show, we talked about the atmosphere last weekend. I know there's a little over 20,000 in attendance at Sanford Stadium. I had the opportunity to attend the Georgia-Auburn game back in 2018 when there was nearly 93,000 in attendance. Obviously, it was nowhere near that in terms of the atmosphere, but given the COVID times and what the atmospheres are like around a lot of the country, it almost seemed as though there were more than 20,500 in attendance that night. So tell us what you can about the atmosphere and your thoughts on where things stand, and is it going to be the same capacity this weekend for Tennessee, I'm assuming?
Yeah, same capacity for Tennessee this weekend. There was certainly a lot of talk from people on social media that it looked like there were more than 20,000 in there, packed into Sanford Stadium. A bunch of the TV shots were of the student section crowded in there. And so, but the atmosphere was great. You talk to players that were out there, they said they really didn't notice a difference. That the defensive guys felt the same kind of buzz that they normally do, that they were, having trouble communicating with each other because of the noise. It wasn't like they could, do it with ease, as if they were out at a practice or something. There was still a huge fan presence on Saturday. And so I think Georgia fans have really, bought into this team and kind of the stories on this team. Like I mentioned, Stetson Bennett, he's kind of become a folk hero around here in Athens. I think, this defense, there's a lot of excitement around this defense and everything that they return. So I think fans are certainly excited to see this team, and that showed on Saturday with the atmosphere inside Sanford Stadium.
And Palmer, just looking at the SEC race, I think everybody looks on paper, it's going to be Florida, Georgia is what everybody thinks. What do you think, in your estimation, the race is going to come down to in the East? And would you say that Georgia is the favorite, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, obviously a lot of that depends on the result Saturday between the Hedges. I mean, if Tennessee can pull an upset, then they're making noise in the East. And, they've got a 9-game winning streak at that point, if that's the case. I see Georgia coming away with the win over the Vols. And so I do think it's going to come down to Georgia and Florida. It's come down to those two teams the last 2 seasons, really. And so I know Georgia and Kentucky played a game back in 2018 that decided the East, but really the Georgia-Florida game the week before that was a clincher for Georgia. Really kind of put the nail in the coffin of Florida's hopes and moved Georgia on to a winner-take-all game against Kentucky. And so I think a lot of the media hype this year has been around Florida, and rightfully so. When you bring back a quarterback like Kyle Trask and one of the best players in college football in Kyle Pitts, certainly one of the most dynamic weapons in the SEC in that tight end. I think it's a great matchup between Georgia and Florida. Dan Mullen and Kirby Smart know each other very well. They've coordinated against each other back when Smart was at Alabama as the defensive coordinator and Mullen was the head coach at Mississippi State. I think that game ultimately comes down to how Georgia's defense lines up against that Florida offense, because, that is certainly strength versus strength there. And that's the two head coaches' philosophies. Mullen, the quarterback guru, Kirby Smart, the defensive-minded head coach. Those two coaches, those two teams are going to go head-to-head on that side of the ball, and that's going to be the deciding factor for the SEC East.
Yeah, what a matchup that will be on November 7th when number 3 UGA, number 3 right now, and number 4 Florida square off, and that will be just a tremendous football game for sure. With that matchup you just alluded to, with the awesome Gators offense and Kyle Trask, and the Georgia defense is so stout. But really appreciate the time, Palmer. Going to be a heck of a game this weekend between Georgia and Tennessee, between the Hedges. 3:30 on CBS. Georgia's anywhere from like a 12.5 to 14-point favorite, depending on where you look. But before we let you go ahead and plug Dogs 24/7 and tell folks how they can read your work and follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. Certainly would look forward to coming back on before that Florida-Georgia matchup. You can find our work over at Dogs 247 and follow me on Twitter at Palmer Thombs. Really appreciate y'all having me on, and looking forward to the matchup this week.
Thanks, Palmer.